made my own slides. I was a bit pushed for time this week, but I'm going to be dealing with the second of what was supposed to be a series of three, and I'm going to hopefully do the last one as well. Talks which look at the interface between true crime, and in this case, a very famous case, and the paranormal. And this particular case, it's the second presentation I've done in the series. Last week or a couple of weeks ago, I gave a story about I did some research and brought some new perspectives that I hope were interesting onto a very famous disappearance case from North America, the Yuba City Five, about five young chaps who went missing in their car on the way home from watching a basketball game. And I made an argument that the paranormal was actually extraordinarily relevant to it in a rather sad and tragic way. This week, I'm looking at a case from 1828 in Suffolk. And on our left, we have Maria Marten, and on our right, William Corder. And the effect of the blood staining on these books I did, sadly, has given them a darker complexion than they probably deserve. But they were both Suffolk yeomanry. I will tell you the story, and I will see what I can do. So let's start with the first slide. Most of you by now have probably gathered that I come from Bury St Edmunds, which is just here, and here's Ipswich. In between the two, there's a town a bit further to the south called Colchester, and there's a village called Polstead. And Polstead is a fairly tiny place. Even today, there's not a lot there. It has a church made of the local flint stones. Flint is an igneous rock, which is very commonly used to build in East Anglia. My father was a flint knapper. And this was the church that presided over the village. And in 1828, we're talking about the age of Jane Austen. So if you think Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and so forth, that gives you very much the idea of the culture. The Regency period has just come to an end. By 1828, we have a king again, but it is the same kind of culture as that of Austen's books. And this is Polstead today. Bruce Hatton took this wonderful shot. I'm very keen when I use them, even if they are copyright free according to the citation, to actually credit the original photographer, because this is marvelous, isn't it? So this is a Polstead as it looks today, and I would imagine it would cost you an absolute fortune to live there if it was not, like my sister's village and Bayton and many of the other villages around there, quite hard to get to. But it's only about an hour from London, and these houses that were for many, many years filled with agricultural labourers and local villagers are increasingly filling up with people who commute into the city. Anyway, the important reason I posted this one is actually the pond at the front, but we'll come back to that in a moment. And moving on, it's at one end of Dedham Vale. This is a photo by Karen Rowe of Dedham Valley. Some of you will know why Dedham is famous. Just before our story is set, a fellow called John Constable, there's a self-portrait of him up there on the top right, Constable had painted a series of paintings. This one is probably the most famous. It's called The Haywain, and this is just a few miles down the road. And the romantic poets and the romantic artists like Constable had very much celebrated the rural idyll and Suffolk life, and this notion of the rural and the picturesque, which means rather than the kind of laid out, carefully, beautiful, arranged 18th century landscapes, you had a jumble of trees. You had wild, you had quaintness, the pictures are composed of things that are not regular. You can see that in this landscape. It's a celebration of the jumbled up nature of the English countryside. One of the first things I absolutely loved when I first came to England from Denmark, after I'd grown up for a while in Denmark, and whenever I came home from Denmark to England, was your English hedges. Your hedgerows are magnificent. They make no sense. They're filled with all kinds of plants. They go everywhere. And I just love the fact you can't look far in England without seeing a stretch of woodland or some bushes or a hedge and, wild flowers and trees that are out of place. It's a really disordered landscape, and I find that very beautiful. Let's move on. 1828, the fashions are at the end. I think we can probably assume, however, that the fashions from a few years before would have still been worn in Polstead in Suffolk. So this was promenading dress. This is what women would have been wearing. In the earlier part of the Regency, you had what was called an Empire line dress, and those essentially were very simple frocks that were worn belted at the waist with a rope usually, and which went straight down. They were almost figure hugging. But by the 1820s, the dresses have filled out and they are more concealing than the earlier dresses. The Empire line dress actually showed off the figure far more. These are as promenading dress for fashionable women in London or Paris, or probably London, actually, these ones, though these are literally fashion plates. You imagine walking around dressed like this, but you would have had a variety of different clothes to wear throughout the day. These are walking out clothes, your best. Okay, having kind of given you the idea of the period, let's move on to the actual story. And I am for once going to read, because having been told that I am rambling, incoherent, and dreadful at talking, I am now going to actually read from notes. So I apologize for that. Growing up in Bury St Edmunds, it's almost impossible not to know the story of Maria Marten and the Red Barn. It was one of the most famous murder cases of the 19th century England. In essence, a fairly tawdry tragedy, there are a number of features, including some overtly supernatural elements, that render it fascinating even to this day. But at the time, the sensation it caused was vast, and it was to have ramifications in popular culture, how murders were reported, and even the English language. I will start with an incredibly brief summary of the case, so if it sounds boring, you can head off and do something more interesting. On Saturday, the 18th of May, 1827, William Corder, right, the son of a prosperous Suffolk family, apparently set out to elope with Maria Marten, who was a village beauty of humble origin. Maria's parents were tenant farmers, relatively prosperous, but were not of the same social class as Corder. And Corder was what we would now call upper middle, I get the impression. He was from the squirearchy. The two of them left the home of Maria and said that they were going to London, but they walked separately through the night to a barn, the now infamous Red Barn, which stood on the Corders' property. Maria was dressed as a man. This was to avoid local notice. In the barn, Maria changed into her women's clothes, and while changing, she was brutally murdered by her boyfriend, William. Corder remained in the little village of Polstead and told Maria's parents that he and Maria were to wed by special license. But to avoid her arrest, because they had already got a 3-year-old son, and there was a charge of, what do they call it? Bastardry is the word they used at the time. Horrible word, but illegitimacy. It wasn't actually, contrary to opinion, it was not actually in British law an offence to have a child outside of wedlock. In fact, many people were born outside of wedlock. It debarred you from being a member of parliament and it debarred you from being a bishop, but even those could be exempted. What was actually a crime was to have a child you could not afford to support. I'll come back to that in a moment because that's actually quite important to our story. Anyway, effectively, he told Maria's parents that she'd gone to London. And then, when he was asked again, he said she's gone to stay with friends near Yarmouth. She was unable to write because she'd injured her hand. And as a result of that, he would have to write for her. And after a short period of time, he was bothered by Mr. and Mrs. Marten wanting to know where their daughter was, as they would. And so he went off to London. And there he wrote and said that they were happily married and living on the Isle of Wight, and requesting that her father burn the letters claiming they were hiding from a Mr. P. Now, Corder came home quite often, and when he did, every time his friends would ask him, "Where's Maria?" And every time he would answer differently. And this was his undoing, because his story was totally inconsistent. Now, in this day and age, you go on the internet, one of my next door neighbours moved to New Zealand, and while she was there, decided to dump her boyfriend while she was on a sports trip, marry a guy she met, and live happily ever after. And we all thought that maybe he'd murdered her because she disappeared, and that was the story he told us. Oh, she went to New Zealand. Well, she didn't come back. She's married and she's living out there now. She went out for a week and decided she was never returning. And she's let me have the house. And, we were all suspicious of the poor fellow. It turned out it was totally true. But these things happen. But in this day and age with the internet, it's still possible to wonder about these things. And yeah. Anyway, Corder was to form the archetype of the wicked squire. He was eventually arrested, charged with murder, and sorry to spoil the ending, he was hanged at Bury St Edmunds. Next door to Ruth Roper's house, though luckily she wasn't living in it at that time. Ruth Roper Wild, who some of you will know, who's a mediator and an expert on road ghosts. The story of William Corder, however, did not die with him. And in fact, it became the basis of a whole number of dramatic presentations. And this is one of them, in a sense. Many of you will have heard or seen scenes that take the mickey out of silent films in which a wicked squire ties a maiden to the railway lines. And in fact, it's got I can't remember what the technical term for it is. I was quite surprised to find out that actually there is no silent film that contains such a scene, or at least no surviving silent film. One of the most depressing facts about early film is that 90% of films that were made before 1900, and there were a lot, there were a considerable number, no longer exist. And even classics like Lon Chaney's London After Midnight, which I think was 1926 or 27, no longer exists because of a studio fire. Long before we had missing Doctor Who episodes, films were being destroyed. So maybe there really was a film which featured a melodrama that featured a wicked squire twiddling his moustache and tying a maiden to the railway line. 1828 was just too early for that, unfortunately. But what did happen was a play known as Maria Marten, or The Murder at the Red Barn, was taken around by amateur dramatic troupes and by professional rep companies, but mainly was taken around villages and played in barns. And this particularly took up in North America, where the phrase barnstorming, but charging into town, doing a quick event and then charging out again, and usually playing Maria Marten's story, became a word. And in fact, that's one of the etymologies offered for barnstorming. Let's move on. What did Corder look like? Well, you can make your own choice. You'll have a chance before the end of this to make your own decision. Did he look like the fellow on the left with his collar turned up, that's a clerical collar, and a rather sinister mien? Or did he look like the fellow on the right as he saw at his trial, who looks much more like a sort of Harry Potter fallen on hard times? I don't know. I'm not sure which you prefer of the two, but those are the two contemporary photos, or not photos, drawings of him. Corder himself, let's tell you a bit about Corder. He was the second son of a prosperous local farmer. The house still stands, the Corder house, and his older brother tragically died when he was in his teens. His Corder's house, which still stands in Polstead today. And, why have I gone backwards? Sorry, I've got the wrong picture there. What I'll do is I will go backwards a bit. Hopefully I can do this. It's not very far back. And when he was a teenager, I think it was actually 9 or 10, but I can't remember the exact date without reading off my phone, which I don't want to do if I can avoid it. His brother went out and was... Oh, yeah, sorry, that was the right one. His brother went out and he was skating on this pond here. You can all see the pond at the front here. And it was frozen over. And in the summer of... In the winter of most of the years, around about the beginning of the 19th century, the Thames was also freezing over. It was during the mini ice age of the 19th century. You had ice fairs which took place on the Thames, And day after day, the kids of the village went out and skated. And I think that's a rather lovely Regency scene. If you imagine the snow, if you imagine the people dressed in their lovely Regency dresses and the gents wearing their hats, and the children probably chasing one another, throwing snowballs, laughing. And then suddenly it all changed when the older brother of Corder, Thomas Corder, plunged through the ice and drowned. They tried to save him, no one could. And William Corder suddenly became the heir to a lot of money. Now, this was unfortunate because sadly, he was a bit of a wrong-un. He had, since he was young, shown a predilection for going off to London. And one thing I should point out is that London, the smoke, was always something that tempted kids from Suffolk. And it was often when they were 13 or 14 years old, they would go and spend a bit of time down in London working in an industry or working in a pub like my ancestors sometimes did, or as domestic servants. And then when they got to their late teens, early 20s, they would come home and marry and they would return to where they'd grown up. But Corder was hanging around with a bit of a fast set, and there were accusations against them of things like horse theft, blackmail, gambling. Basically, he was hanging out with the wrong type, according to the locals. So I'm sorry about the lettering at the bottom. We've never worked out how to turn that off. If we could, we would, I promise you. It's been happening for weeks now. Hang on, I'll try it later. Maybe Christian can work out how to turn it off. In the meantime, however, Corder had met up with a young lady. Well, he'd met up with several young ladies. In fact, he was rumoured to have got several young ladies into trouble in London. But he returned home and there he found the lovely Maria Marten. Now, I had a friend called Miss Martin, who I won't give her first name. Actually, yes, I will. Why not? Rachel Martin, the incredibly beautiful Rachel Martin, who lived in Suffolk. And I always tend to think of, because of the family connections, because of the fact that families are so close, I often think of Maria like her. But there she is on the right. That's Maria as she looked, as she was drawn by those who knew her in life, or by the descriptions to J.C. Curtis and his artist. And on the left, we see a 1932 Todd Slaughter and Company, Maria Marten or the Murder in the Red Barn. We see various, down the decades, various depictions. And even today, there are ballads. I would say probably the best treatment, if you want to understand the kind of ethos that developed around it in Victorian society, the closest you'll get to it was in the birthday party. What was he called? Nick Cave. Nick Cave of the Bad Seeds. He did an album called Murder Ballads, which includes him singing a song about murdering Kylie Minogue with Kylie Minogue when they were going out. And that has very much the kind of ethos, the same kind of spirit, the same kind of culture that emerges around it. I think it's a bit sad for poor old Maria on the right, looking a bit, if you see her looking here and thinking, heck, all of that is me? What's going on? Because she was not at all the kind of girl, I get the impression, who would have appreciated all this attention. She actually seems to have been quite quiet, and her friends said that she was a good girl, but she was the mother of two illegitimate children. Now, her first two illegitimate children were born to her not from William Corder, but from the mysterious Mr. P. Mr. P's family, we know who Mr. P was. I'm not going to name him because his family are still today prosperous and important individuals, and because they take great offence against claims being made. But Mr. P, whose identity doesn't matter for our purposes, was a lord. He was of the aristocracy, or at least the gentry. And the reason that she was never prosecuted for having his children was because he would send money to look after them. And as long as he paid for them, no one cared. Do you remember what I said about illegitimacy? So there's a massive illegitimacy is a social crime. Having babies the state has to pay for, not a religious offence by 1827. And that is something that I think it takes a bit of getting our heads around. Maria lived with her mum and dad in this cottage, which I don't think could be more romantic if you tried. You can see the roses around the door, or maybe it's honeysuckle. It was a thatched cottage, and it still stands today. And let's have a look at what it looks like in reality. That's from J.C. Curtis's book that was published at the time of the murder. And that's the real cottage as it is today. Beautiful, but, substantial. She was not from an immensely poor background. She was relatively affluent herself. She received £5 a quarter from Mr. P for their children to be raised. And Mr. P was the reason, apparently, that she had to leave town. Mr. P did not approve of her becoming acquainted, let's go back, with William Corder. Mr. P actually may have been quite jealous about it. I suspect Mr. P was actually married and had no right to be jealous about it, but Maria Marten was the mother of his children, and he didn't want Corder having anything to do with her. So Corder and her had to do something when she got pregnant by Corder. She was honest enough not to claim that it was Mr. P's child. She probably hadn't, had any kind of relations with him for a long time. And so they went off to live in that most exotic and exciting of all metropolises, Sudbury. For those of you who've never been to Sudbury, Sudbury's very close to Borley Rectory. It's about 3 miles away across the fields. And in fact, all of this occurs within 12 miles of Borley. So if you only navigate Britain by ghost stories, you're basically on the doorstep of Borley Rectory and about halfway down to the place I talked about when I gave the story about Lagenhome. Right, okay. Maria goes to Sudbury, and while there, unfortunately, she has a stillbirth. And that stillbirth, this was a second child. Corder said he was going to have the child taken off and buried at Sudbury churchyard. And he was last seen taking the poor innocent baby away in a box. And sadly, he buried him in a field, and the site where the baby was interred is not known. He never revealed where he got rid of the baby's remains. I'm so sorry. I should have given a trigger warning about that. There are no other references to the loss of infants today. Okay, so after that great sadness, what happened next? Maria and William remained lovers despite the gulf in their social position, which was nothing like the gulf, however, between Maria and Mr. P. And Corder's family did not like Maria. They called her all kinds of things. Now, most of his siblings were to die of tuberculosis within a few years. His elder brother died in a skating accident. And Mrs. Corder, who was the only one left, was the mother. She was still going, but she had control of the money. Now, most people think that in this era, what have I done? That in this era, the money would have gone automatically to the oldest son. Sadly, not for him, not so. What actually is going on here? Up to this point, nothing paranormal, nothing very exciting, just a village romance with a lady who has children with a couple of fathers. He's a bit of a wrong-un. She is now in danger, having a living child as well, of being prosecuted because Corder can't afford to give the amount of money that is required to demonstrate that he's looking after the child. Because Corder's mother won't give him any money to give to Maria because she doesn't like him, doesn't like her. So Corder's parents thought he should go and find a respectable wife, but he didn't. So twice they planned to elope and go to London. But each time William Corder backed out. And each time Maria got very upset and became depressed and walked around the village. And her younger sister was accused during this period of being a tart. And she was accused of, the term tart was used at the time, she was accused of dressing up and flirting with men and acting inappropriately. And it was suggested that the older sister wasn't much better. So because of all the moral condemnation, the village gossip that was coming against them, it was decided that they had no choice, but they had to leave. Maria also was suffering from the loss of her child, which is very sad, and she had health problems. She never recovered from that. And when she went to Corder on the third occasion to demand they elope, she said, "I'm about to be arrested. What are you actually going to do about it? Because if you don't take me away, I am going to be arrested tonight." Now, actually, that probably wasn't true. The village authorities had no intention of taking action against her. They were not particularly worried because they knew that Corder had money and everybody knew who the child belonged to. So there was no pressing need. But she wanted to be made an honest woman of, and Corder should marry her. So she went to him and said, "Let's go to London." And he said, "Okay, you will go. You will go home, get your stuff, take my clothes." And she took some of his clothes, dress as me. So she dresses as a man. She goes home under the cover of night. She enters the house. She tells her mother that she's leaving. She explains to her sister she's going to London where she'll be married and that she'll send letters. And she takes her few possessions and she goes off to meet her boyfriend at the Red Barn. And I think the pathos of that is quite sad. She believed him absolutely. Unfortunately, I think Corder himself also believed it at this point because he set off and he prepared things and he made his way. And the problem was that if they were going to get married in London, they would need a special license because normally you have to read banns, which means you have to read out in your parish of residence your names in case anyone can give a reason why you can't be lawfully married. But even today, you can get married by special license for £64. Should any of you ever find yourself marrying an immigrant who does not have residential status in the UK, you might find that the Home Office would say, no, you can't marry them. Actually, you can. If you go to a bishop and the bishop approves, or a Church of England minister, it's usually a bishop, they will write for £60 or considerably less if they're sympathetic to your story, a special license. The state, the Church of England in Britain is part of the state, the government, and that is essentially giving your partner the right to marry you, and that gives you the right to remain. A very little used loophole in our immigration law. It was still the case 10 years ago. It probably might have been tightened up by now, but the Church of England still holds the position nowadays that if people wish to marry, then they should be allowed to marry. It's ironic how long they took to come around to that conclusion on marriage between people of the same gender, but let's move on from that. Church is sometimes slow to adapt and people have different opinions, I suppose, but to this day you can get married by a special license. On the fatal night then they set out. Now we know that they did not have any intention of arresting her, but we don't know why Corder did what he did next. He made his way, and about an hour after he went to Martin's cottage to see if she'd left, he went and met her at the barn. She then changed out of Corder's clothes into her own, and while he was doing so, while she was getting changed, they began to have an argument. No one knows what the argument involved, but he said that he was infuriated with her. He then grabbed his pistol and shot her in the head. Yeah. Many times I have been annoyed and had arguments with people, but I so far have never discharged a firearm into their head. Having done so, he then took his sword and, realizing that she was not properly dead, he stabbed her twice through the chest, through the heart. And then, because she still wasn't dead, he grabbed the neckerchief around her neck, the handkerchief or scarf she was wearing, and pulled on it until she was strangled. And that's what happened to Maria Marten. I think you could call it overkill. It's clear that it was a very, very passionate thing. He then went to a cottage close to the barn and asked if he could borrow a spade and a pickaxe. And firstly, he borrowed a spade and he went back to the barn and was busily digging away. No one really asked him why he wanted a spade in the middle of the night. And an hour or so later, he was seen walking across a field carrying a pickaxe. He was told soon after that he'd been seen carrying a pickaxe, not in London, but, and not with Maria, by Maria's youngest brother. And the youngest brother was quite convinced it was Corder. But Corder argued, oh, no, it was a mistake. That was just one of my agricultural labourers who was grubbing up trees wearing my velvet coat, a velveteen coat. In fact, the same coat part was true, and there had been a labourer wearing Corder's coat that night, but the labourer had never carried a pickaxe that year as far as he could concern. Corder buried the body just 1.5 feet under the floor of the barn, and then he cleared up all the blood. From that day on, he always carried the key to the barn, and when the harvest was brought in that August, he insisted on opening up the barn himself and ensuring that the crops were laid over the spot where Maria was buried. During the harvest, though, there was a peculiar incident. One of his farm hands was sitting talking to him, and they were drinking, I think. And you would imagine them drinking cider after a hard day working in the fields. And he suddenly turned to the man and said, if I give you £1, would you cut my throat? No, said the man. Why would I do that? I would go to prison for murder or be hanged. I would be hanged. No, he said, I want you to do it. Cut my throat. The farm labourer, just thinking he was joking, laughed it off, and Corder shrugged and carried on as if nothing had happened. Perhaps he was joking, or perhaps he was under a tremendous strain. Now, the actual barn, here's the first picture of the barn, and that dates from nearest to the time. I think it actually looks almost plausible as to what the barn looked like, but J.C. Curtis, who went there, actually gives us a much better impression. His artist went and drew the picture from life. That is the Red Barn. Now, I don't know if anyone knows why it was called the Red Barn, but there is a story in Suffolk that red barns are haunted. You never paint the barn red because it will be the site of a murder. But actually, it's not the paint that matters. The reason it was called the Red Barn, according to local gossip and folklore at least, is it lay to the west of the village. So at night, when the sun was setting out over, exotic parts to far to the west, Peterborough, Northampton, Oxford, wherever, as the sun was going down, people in the village, if they looked out, would see the sun through the cracks in the barn. And the red light that suffused through gave the look of the barn of being on fire. There's a very famous Suffolk ghost story about a barn on fire. I'll tell it one day, but I won't today because we're a bit short on time. But this particular red barn effect was said to be associated with places where murders were committed. Did Corder commit the murder there because the barn had a reputation for being cursed? Or did the curse actually come true? No. He must have known. The barn was surrounded on 3 sides by outbuildings, and the sheds actually looked much more like these ones here on this picture. So there were outbuildings around it, and it was a substantial building. There was a gate that was 7 foot high, and there was a fence all the way round. So it's almost a little fortress. You don't get into the Red Barn unless you've got a key. And even though the thatch would have needed changing every 7 years, there was no way anyone could go and look. Now, after Maria went missing, you would have thought people would be very, cynical about where she was. But in fact, Corder would disappear off for months on end, saying he was off to be with Maria. And he told people that she was now in the Isle of Wight. In reality, he was in London. For the next 11 months, Maria Marten's body lay buried in the Red Barn. And finally, if you were wondering why this is an ASSAP webinar, we come to the supernatural aspect, the first one. From the inquest report, Providence led to the unveiling of the murder. In fact, the events which led to the discovery of the body have been a staple of supernatural books from then onwards, because Maria was discovered after her mother had a dream. She was sleeping one night and she dreamt many times of Maria, and she was disheartened by the fact that She couldn't recognize Maria's handwriting because of the hand injury. She normally only got letters from William, but nonetheless, she kept having dreams. And in the dreams, Maria insisted that she was dead. Now, actually, those dreams could very easily have just been common sense. I mean, the whole story was ridiculously fishy, but the dreams were carried on. And in the dreams, Maria said that she was buried in the Red Barn. Now, there were lots of other places where it would have made more sense to get rid of a body around there. I'm not going to go into a list of them. I don't actually want to send people out to bury people all over Suffolk, but there are other places where you could hide a body where it's very unlikely they would be found. But the Red Barn, which was owned by Corder, would be an extremely stupid place to leave a body. Nonetheless, it was that the stepmother, it was actually the stepmother of Maria, Maria's real mother had died long before, kept seeing the ghost. And finally, we know from the Times on April the 22nd, 1828, that the dream, which occurred for 3 successive nights, finally convinced her husband to go and look for his daughter. Now, the papers made a great deal of this, but in this era of great skepticism, because 1827-28 was an era when people certainly did not believe in ghosts very much, they offered critical comment as well. The evidence for anything supernatural being involved seems weak. Maria and Corder had always met, and one presumes made love, in the Red Barn. It was their place. They were known by the whole village to frequent it. As early as immediately after Maria left for Yarmouth, the parents were suspicious something had happened to her, which is why they cross-examined Corder after their 9-year-old son said he saw him carrying a pickaxe on the night he was supposedly eloping. Many times Maria's father said he thought of entering the building to look for evidence, but he never did because of the aforementioned difficulty of access and the fact the barn was Mrs. Corder's property. He didn't mind really upsetting William, but he didn't want to upset his mother. Even after his wife's dreams, when finally convinced he must search the barn, he went to Corder's mother and asked for permission. Okay, so a group of people go down there. He said he wanted to look for some of Maria's clothing, which he may have believed may have been left in there. To be honest, such deference by farm labourers and the rural poor towards big farmers and landowners is not uncommon even today. So Mr. Martin took his friend, Mr. Pryke, and armed with a spade and a rake and a mole spud. The spade was a particular type of spade called a mole spud, and you use them for the purpose of digging up molehills and killing moles. Dogs can do that even faster, but it's a slightly strange kind of thing, and it's used for putting in potatoes and various other agricultural purposes. I've actually seen the one they carried that day. I'll show you a picture of it shortly. They went to the very spot that was indicated in the dream, and within moments they had uncovered the remains of poor Maria, much decomposed, indeed mainly skeletal. They fetched others, and during the exhumation of the body it was noticed there was a mark on the wall where a pistol had been fired, which apparently missed any target. Corder habitually carried 2 pistols, percussion caps, so it was not surprising. Well, it looked bad for him. So the dream, was it supernatural? On the contrary, the bizarre way Maria, who could read and write and was close to her parents, had stopped writing, the conflicting stories, the inquiries badly deflected from Corder by Mr. P, who still was sending faithfully his fiver for Maria, and village gossip all means that the dream was probably little more than a reflection of all too conscious anxiety on the part of the stepmother. She may have even made it up to finally make her husband, who'd spent 11 months doing nothing at all but worrying, to actually go and check Maria was not dead in the Red Barn. Some modern skeptics have actually suggested that the Martens killed their own daughter and that William Corder was innocent and that the Martens used the dream as a method of framing him. I believe that is complete nonsense, and the trial record, and I have read the entirety of the trial record, seems to make a nonsense of that suggestion. The dream caused a sensation at the time, but there's no reason to believe it displayed any supernormal faculty on the part of Mrs. Marten. If that seems disappointing, don't worry, the ghosts are still coming. Anyway, there are things that do seem done. We're not done with the supernatural. I'm going to return to other supernatural elements later. But the most uncanny thing about the discovery of the body is how long it took. However, I do have a theory here. Not only did Corder have the barn key, but until April, the area where the body was buried was under winter hay, the cattle food. So only after the cows returned to grazing could they turn the hay over and examine it. Therefore, the Martins were probably patiently awaiting that chance. As a result of all this, well, it's absolutely clear that the dream was enough to get Corder into trouble. Where was Corder? What was he doing in London? Ladies and gentlemen, this is what he was doing. William Corder's Lonely Hearts Club Band. William Corder invented a whole industry. He brought out the first example of the following. Matrimony. A private gentleman, aged 24, entirely independent, whose disposition is not to be exceeded, has lately lost chief of his family by the hand of Providence, which has occasioned discord among the remainder, under circumstances most disagreeable to relate. To any female of respectability who would study for domestic comforts, and willing to confide her future happiness to one in every way qualified to render the marriage state desirable, as the advertiser is in affluence. Many very happy marriages have taken place through means similar to that which is now resorted to, and it is hoped that no one will answer this through impertinent curiosity. But should this meet the eye of any agreeable lady who feels desirous of meeting with sociable, tender, kind, and sympathizing companion, they will find this advertisement worthy of notice. Honour and secrecy may be relied upon. As some little security against idle applications, it is requisite that letters may be addressed, postpaid, AZ, care of Mr. Foster, stationer, 68 Leadenhall Street, with your real name and address, which will meet with the most respectful attention. Yes, Corder invented the Lonely Heart advert. Although it suggests it was not the first, it's the first one we know of. Oh, sorry, this next picture. So the man who invented the Lonely Hearts Club, here's where he buried his previous wife, his previous girlfriend. What does that tell you about Tinder? What does that tell you about Grindr? What does that tell you about dating agencies? What it tells you is they are a bad thing. Of course, James Horan, the famous parapsychologist, actually also wrote and invented the algorithm that's used by almost every modern dating agency, I believe. So perhaps they're not a bad thing, just in case he decides that he's going to sue me. Maybe they're a wonderful thing. But on this particular occasion, unfortunately, he received over 100 replies. 2 definitely gained his attention. One was from a mysterious lady who wanted to meet with him, perhaps with the intent of immediate marriage at a London church. She described herself and told Corder to wear his arm in a sling and to wear a black handkerchief around his neck and attend a certain service where they would meet. Corder, however, his carriage was delayed, he missed the service, arrived after the lady had left, and he afterwards discovered that the woman making inquiries for such a man was a high-ranking lady with a huge fortune. He planned to try and contact her again, but then he met his wife-to-be. The lady he did meet, Miss Moore, he met in a public place. Remember, when dating with mysterious strangers, always meet in public. Once they'd met, the two were wed, and while the marriage was to last only 8 or so months before Corder was executed, it was genuinely happy. Mr. and Mrs. Corder opened a respectable boarding school for girls at Grove House, Ealing Lane, London. So there you go. If you send your daughter to a respectable boarding school for girls, you know what to expect. Murderers. The demon headmaster. It was there, living with his wife and the pupils, that he was to be arrested for murder. After the discovery of Maria's body, it was quickly ascertained by missing teeth, clothing, jewellery and a small lump on the neck that the corpse was Maria. There was only one suspect, and unfortunately the village constable set off to London to find Corder. London being outside the jurisdiction of Suffolk Police, he went to a police station where a policeman named Leah was assigned to the case. It took him 14 hours to locate William Corder, despite having absolutely no idea where he might be, or even if he was in London, which I think, even by today's standards, is an incredible achievement. If Corder had actually changed his name or tried to hide, he would probably not have been found. But he was easily located, and Mr. Lear entered his house, pretending he wished to place one of his daughters at the Corder finishing school. As soon as he had Corder in his study, he told him the game was up and Maria Marten was found. 3 times Corder denied knowing the girl. Wonderfully biblical, isn't it? And Peter denied him 3 times. Corder was arrested nonetheless, his sword taken along with a small black handbag that was once the property of Maria Marten. Inside it were found Corder's pistols. Corder was taken back to Suffolk to face the charge of his murder. His wife, who believed the charge was bigamy at first, stood by him and did so until their final parting the day before he was hanged. He was held overnight at the Georgian in Colchester, and on the second night was transferred in the early mornings to the Cock Pub at Polstead, where the inquest on Maria Marten was held at 10 the next morning. By 10 a.m. the Cock was filled with interested persons and representatives of the London press. There was an argument between the coroner, Wayman, about the press as to whether or not they could take notes for their articles. The coroner ruled against them, so the accounts of the proceedings had to be filed from memory. The coroner also noticed that the sensation was so great and that papers, preachers and puppet shows were ignoring the innocent before proven guilty, had declared Corder the murderer to great prejudice against him. There were already puppet shows up and down the country about the murder, which ended with his hanging. There's a strong irony in this, as we'll shortly see. Proceedings were delayed by Corder's representative asking, may he come downstairs and witness the testimony? This was an inquest, not a trial. The coroner ruled against him and stated he may have the witness statements read to him afterwards. Corder came down, but was forced to return to his room upstairs, while it was determined how Maria had died. This proved extremely difficult. She'd been shot, stabbed 2 or 3 times, and strangled. It wasn't possible to decide if she was even dead when she was buried, so live burial was added to the list. In the end, there were 9 different possibilities as to exactly how Corder had killed her. So at the trial, Corder was charged with murdering her in each of the 9 ways, to make sure one of them stuck. Murder by pistol, murder by stabbing in the heart, murder by stabbing in the neck, murder by live burial. This legal nicety, like the fact everything in the charge must be valued, stabbed by a sword, worth 1 shilling, buried in gravel and soil, of no value, seems a bit odd to us today. Strangled by scar, worth 1 farthing. The fact you have to value the items which you used for the murder is just... The important thing is that the inquest determined that Maria had, however she died, been murdered. Corder was taken to prison at Bury St Edmunds to await his trial. And then it was discovered that he was facing another capital crime. He wasn't just guilty of murder. He'd also been taking the £5 off Mr. P. Remember? Well, if Maria was dead and he wasn't looking after the children, in fact, I don't even know what happened to the children. They were presumably placed with a wet nurse. But Maria was dead and she was the only one who could legally take the money. He had signed receipts for the money, and therefore it seems very likely he was guilty of fraud. And fraudsters in 19th century England were almost always hanged. If you gave a false check, or you signed your name to a document and you committed fraud, it didn't matter how much the courts pleaded for you, you would almost certainly be executed. If you murdered someone, you were much more likely to be given a pardon. We'll never know if Corder was guilty of the crime, but it does appear likely. On the 14th of April 1828, he arrived at the White Hart in Manningtree, stating he had business with the bank opposite, Messrs. Alexander. Making conversation with Mr. Dale, the landlord, he explained he was an agent sent to cash a cheque, and there he committed fraud again, as he presented a cheque for £93 on the Hadley branch payable to a Mr. Cook of Wenham Hall from the account of Mr. Atkins, butcher of Stratford. The banker, Mr. Taylor, refused, as he didn't know either party, but Corder explained he was Cook and was well known in the area. The landlord of the White Hart helpfully said he knew Mr. Cook by sight, so the money was handed over. The presumed Mr. Cook was paid in local currency notes. At that time, there were some local currency still used, and Cook/Corder dashed off to the branch banking establishment at Ipswich, where he exchanged the local notes for gold and departed before the fraud was discovered that night. When arrested, his wife found £80 in gold in his drawer, and Corder never denied the charges, simply saying, "I dare say they'll try to make enough of it." He appeared defeated when he was confronted, and he would almost certainly have been hanged for that crime if not for taking Mr. P's money, and least of all, for murdering his poor girlfriend, Maria. One of the curious things about Corder's life is he never seemed to have any money. That's the fate of many of us, but Corder was from an affluent upper middle class home. His father was dead, his brother's deaf, he was heir to a farm which was extensive. The Corders were important people, yet he hints time and time again at trouble at home with his family, and while it's clear he doted on his mother, she seems to have been unwilling to surrender any control over finances to him. So, she took his side in the family squabbles, but she wasn't going to give any money while he was going out with Maria. And his biggest problem was he was a snappy dresser with expensive tastes, who spent all his money on looking flash and grabbing your attention. The trial, which was held at Bury St Edmunds, continued the sensation. The Chief Baron of the Exchequer, of the Chancellery, William Alexander, presided, the highest-ranking judge in England, and his orders were that no one was to be admitted till he's taken his seat, which led to absolute chaos as crowds fought outside to get in. And once his carriage arrived, it took an hour and a half for him to be able to get into his own courtroom and for the trial to finally begin. Corder was charged with murder on 9 counts to cover all the possible ways he disposed of Maria, and was horrified and outraged to discover that Coroner Wayland was now the prosecutor. That meant that the coroner had already seen all the evidence and cross-examined the witnesses, but the defence had not had access to anything at all. The case against Corder was substantial. He was last seen with the victim, who was found in his barn with wounds that could have been made by his pistol and sword. He'd lied for 11 months about her whereabouts. He took his sword to be sharpened before the murder. There was no evidence he planned to procure the promised marriage license or elope with her. He actually appeared to take special care to cover up the burial site. For the first time in his life, he kept the barn locked after the murder. He made endless lies to her family, friends, and Mr. P about where she was. Maria was unhappy when they set out on the fatal night. Corder had been terrorizing with claims. Basically, he had refused to give an address to her parents, claiming the couple were in fear of Mr. P, who, whatever his moral failings, seemed to have actually done a great deal to look after Maria. The picture from the trial that emerges of Corder is of a weak, not very bright schemer who lied endlessly, and just dug himself further and further into a pit with his constant lies. He doesn't actually seem to have known what the truth was. Yet there was more to the man than this. He had many friends, his new wife was devoted to him, and those who came to know him in jail felt sympathy or even liking for the fellow. He was clever enough to work hard on his defence, and his wife and he believed that Corder would be acquitted, and perhaps today he would be on technicalities. There didn't seem any hope of claiming the manner of death was incorrect and try for a technicality, though, because he was charged with all 9 of them. His second chance was stronger. He had to argue the body was not Maria Marten. Unfortunately, he chose to admit it was, and in doing so, well, what hope was there? His third strategy was to object to the coroner now being employed as the prosecutor, and the judge would probably have allowed that, as it was to Corder's point the notoriety of the case that he'd been judged guilty by the press and public long before the trial began. He did decide, the only thing he could think of, to claim that Maria Marten committed suicide and he covered up her death. According to Corder, the pistols had been in Maria's possession since their time in Sudbury, when she took them to have them repaired. The gunsmith testified a man and a woman collected them, but others did testify to seeing them in Maria's possession. In his summing up, the judge mentioned Corder snapping them to fire at Maria's cottage on the fatal night. I'm not sure why he did this, but it sounds like he had the pistols when he left the house. The pistols that were found in Corder's school, in Maria's handbag, were certainly the pistols. He claims that as they left the house to elope, Maria was seen by her family to be crying, and as she changed at the barn, she accused Corder of many things, abused him, and compared him unfavourably with Mr. P. He then called off the elopement and wedding, said that if she spoke to him like that now, how would she speak to him when they were married? And saying he would not marry her, he walked away. As he did so, he heard a shot and turned to see her lying dead, having shot herself dead in the head with his pistol. Okay, he then panicked, concealed the body, cleaned up the scene, and he claims that the sword marks through her chest were actually made by the mole spade. The greatest problem facing Corder was how to explain the evidence that the neckerchief pulled tight enough to have throttled the girl. He claimed this happened as he dragged her to the grave. And he also claimed that the marks, which 3 surgeons said were made by the sword, were actually those made by the spade. The jury retired and spent over an hour discussing the case and found him guilty. He was sentenced to hang on the Monday and was taken from the court in a state of near collapse. Finally, taken out, he was offered a lot of religious literature and pious exhortations. Clergy and others sought an interview, but Corder refused to see anyone apart from the chaplain. Finally, on the morning of his execution, he wrote and witnessed a confession. According to this, the argument was actually about the burial of their child. Maria was worried the baby's body would be uncovered. Why is hard to understand, though it was speculated that Corder had killed the child. In the barn, they fell to fighting. Corder pulled out his pistol, fired, and Maria fell dead. He covered up the crime. He was led out and hanged. And where he was hanged, the wall still stands. As I said, Rupert Roper Wilde grew up, and her ghost stories take place in the street directly behind the wall where Corder was executed. There you see Corder's hanging. Now, I'm just going to warn you before we go on to the next image that there are human remains. So if you find that disturbing, please avert your eyes and I'll tell you when you can look again. And here we can see where Ruth grew up behind that wall. There's the wall of Bury Jail. And there's the execution of Corder with 7,000 people present. The last hanging at Bury Jail occurred in the memory of my grandmother, my great-grandmother and great-grandfather. And my grandmother, growing up, was always told that Kant was the last man hanged at Bury Jail and Will was the man who did it. So whenever she said she couldn't do something or can't do something, she was told Kant was the last man hanged at Bury Jail and Will was the man who did it. That was actually true. It was Will was the hangman, William, and James Kant was the last man hung at Bury Jail. But it entered into Bury vernacular. I doubt anyone said that phrase for 100 years now, or at least 50 years since she told it to me. Obviously, she told it to me, so it's 50 years, not 100, but there you go. But I don't think it's something that many people would understand now in Bury St Edmunds even. Right, so what happened? Well, he was hanged by being thrown off the platform, pushed off the platform. His neck would have broken quite quickly, but it didn't. So the crowd and the jailers and his friends, the hangman, came down and pulled on his legs from underneath to break his neck and kill him quickly. So that was the end of poor old William Corder. Now, here is Moyses Hall in Bury St Edmunds. My sister used to work there. That was where she sat. And it is said to be haunted. And I was actually planning to take ASSAP there because through some family connections and the fact I know the people who work there, I have been told the ghost stories over the years. And oddly, no one has ever associated with a ghost with Corder. Now, I say oddly because the museum has some rather unusual artifacts. And the haunting there, which consists of footsteps moving around and strange noises and banging and things carrying on, it's quite marked. And I've always thought it'd be great fun to go and spend a night there. My sister wasn't sure if it was coming from Superdrug next door, but there you go. But the office is actually roughly where the clock is and those windows below, those kind of Romanesque arches. Now, Moyses Hall Museum, please avert your gaze at this point if you're of sensitive disposition, contains the death mask of William Corder on the left. So you can now decide which of the pictures of him is the most realistic. After he was hanged, he was taken down and a wax impression was made of his face and used to make this, which is a rather wonderful image of what he looked like in death. They obviously couldn't make the hair, but they did the best they could. Over here is his actual scalp. That is his head, and you can see his ear down there. And underneath, there's a copy in the museum to this day of the trial record, and that is bound in the skin of William Corder. So when I said that this might be slightly disturbing to some, I didn't lie, did I? His remains were not given to his family. They were passed to the anatomists, the surgeons at the West Suffolk, as it is today, in those days St Mary's Teaching Hospital in Bury St Edmunds, and he was dissected. His body was taken apart. His brain was examined. And over the years, various parts of him have been mislaid, and other parts have been found and have developed a strange story of being cursed. Now, the trial was, his skin was taken to a leather maker, and a bookbinder bound a book in his thing. His scalp was brought and was eventually given to the museum. His death mask is there. The museum also has the pistols. These are the pistols that were used. Some items at the top that were owned by Maria herself. And there is the mole spud. The mole spade is down there. You can see it's broken now, but that is the device. And I remember using those as a child myself. And on the right, there is the book of the trial record, which obviously I've handled. Not many people have, but I did have the opportunity as a young boy to actually, touch the exhibits and have a look at them. And the Moyses Hall, to this day, it remains a really interesting museum. There's some stone coffins upstairs which have human remains in. And when my sister was there was quite a controversy, because museums generally are now encouraged not to maintain human remains, and they should be returned to the family for burial, etc. So they set about tracing William Corder's closest living relatives. And they found them. Maria Marten's relatives were actually surprisingly easy to find, but they don't have a say in this. But William Corder's do, because it's his human remains that are in the building. And they were asked, do you want them to be taken out and buried, destroyed or buried? And they replied, some of them replied, yes, absolutely, because they were disgusted that their relatives' bodies were on show in a local museum. But there was also a couple of gentlemen, quite a few of them, who were absolutely the opposite. And they said, no, it's fantastic. We take the kids to see them, go see great-great-great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-great-great-uncle, Corder. And they did not want them to be removed. They wanted them to remain forever as a testament to the story and the memory of William and Maria. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? If your ancestor was hanged, would you choose to have them displayed? Well, the decision was made in the end. They had to work out with expert genealogists. It was taken to court, and the discovery was that the ones who wanted them to remain were the ones with the legal right. So they made the decision. They're still there to this day. There's also a gibbet cage from Livermere, the road between Livermere and Honington, that was dug up in the 60s. And it's in the late 18th century, a maid who was walking down the road from Honington through Troston was murdered on the Livermere Road down there. And the fellow who did it was hanged, and he was placed in a gibbet cage. And I don't think you can see it on here. That isn't it, I don't think. No, it's not. But there is, the gibbet cage is in there as well. So it's a cage in which the body was left to decompose. And when it eventually fell down, it was just buried in the field. And incidentally, I think that was one of the inspirations for one of James's stories, because the stone on Thetford Heath, Barnham Common as was where I grew up, just outside of Livermere, there's a stone there with a socket in it, and he references it in one of his stories. I can't remember which one it is. Anyway, let's move on from that. So Moyses Hall is said to be haunted by the ghost of Corder. Where else is? Well, Corder's skull was taken to the West Suffolk. His skeleton was taken to the West Suffolk. And when it was at the West Suffolk Hospital, it was used by generations of trainee doctors and medical students. And the story developed that Corder's skull was associated with violent poltergeist activity. And eventually, a teaching surgeon took it in the 1930s back to his house in Bury. And interestingly, the phenomena followed to him. Now, the question which arises is, does it do so because there is a spirit attached to the skull, or does it do so because the fellow who took it was aware of the legend and causes the poltergeist activity by his own psychic powers because he believes he's being haunted? You've all probably heard me talk on this so many times, I'm not going to go into great detail on it, but it's interesting that Corder's mortal remains have to this day an association with hauntings. The recent years there have been a number of attempts to suggest Corder wasn't guilty. It's the nature of our age that we reevaluate the past and try and find things. As this appears to be one of the most open and shut cases I can possibly imagine, and he confessed that he did it, it's really hard to think of any kind of explanation. But there are two possibilities. At times, rumours have circulated that Corder was having an affair with Maria's stepmother, who was actually not much older than Maria. They were close enough in age that they sometimes could pass for sisters. And she was involved, hence her knowledge of the burial site. I find that ridiculous. Why would she have then turned around and told her husband? Why would Corder not have stated so? Other authors have made great stress on Corder's criminal associates, which included a gypsy fortune teller lady, but all this strikes me as nonsense. Corder was there when she died, covered up the death, and was, unless he was telling the truth about suicide. Maria was certainly deeply depressed that night, and perhaps she did have the pistols. If so, perhaps the handkerchief round her neck was irrelevant, as Corder suggested. The sword wounds could have been made, and as a child, I remember using mole spades with those blades, which we use for tree planting today. So, what happened? Well, we know that Price probed the ground with the handle of his rake and found an iron spike, perhaps part of Corder's pickaxe. So, did Maria shoot herself? I doubt it. I don't think so. I think Corder would have realised if she had committed suicide that he would have made things worse. The second, slightly more plausible theory is there was a suggestion of a double suicide. Each fired a pistol at their own head, but Corder fired his into the wall in a moment of cowardice, deciding not to actually kill himself. That would explain why there was a bullet at head height in the wall, but I think it's more likely that he was fighting with Maria and shot. So in Moyses Hall Museum today, you can see the relics and Corder's skin. And as I said, one doctor who was fascinated by the grim artifact is said to have taken the skull and replaced it with another. He then returned it, and sadly, to this day, we don't actually know where Corder's skull is. Though it is said, the last I heard was that the Royal College of Surgeons has the whole skeleton, and it's used down in London. It's kept there for exhibition purposes and still used for teaching. Now, if Corder's skeleton is at the Royal College of Surgeons, it should be possible to procure it for experimental purposes, or at least for DNA analysis, which would be interesting in itself, just to see if it is related to one of Corder's descendants and who is the closest. But also, I could see that as there are certainly people involved in psychical research within the Royal College, it would also be possible for us to carry out some experiments using it. Let's just move on a little bit more, though, because this building, Moyses Hall, and the relics became suddenly mixed up in something else a few years ago. And at the time, I made the association, and a few years ago, oh, sorry, let's go back. I need to go forwards a bit more. So a young RAF doctor by the name of Corrie McKeague came walking down, there he is, past the Grapes one night. He'd been for a night out, and he was seen to walk down, and he gets to the back of Moyses Hall. And there's Superdrug. You'll see the white building, and Moyses Hall, the back of it is red brick there, but the Moyses Hall is off to the left, and you'll notice a St Edmundsbury bin lorry. And on the right, you'll notice there are some bins. Tragically, what is believed to have happened, well, it's a locked room mystery. Corrie entered this area behind Moyses Hall and was never seen alive again. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning. It had just started to rain. I believe he was eating chips that he'd bought at the top of St Andrew Street. And I spent a lot of time desperately trying to work out where he could have gone. Now, at 5:30, about 15, 20 minutes after he entered this area, a bin lorry came in and emptied the bins. And the obvious thing was, had he for some reason entered the bins, perhaps to stay out of the rain, and been tipped into the back of the lorry and taken off to a tip. And in fact, that was the first thing that West Suffolk Police thought of. But the figures they were given for the weight of the lorry indicated he couldn't possibly have been in it. It was only a recycling run. In reality, it turned out that the lorry driver had given the right data, the right records, but then mixed up kilograms and pounds at the depot. And in fact, the weight was commensurate with Mr. McKeag having disappeared. To this day, there are endless conspiracy theories about what appears to have been a tragic accident. And something I was able to actually tell people at the time, which I don't think many people realized, is that approximately 5 people have died every decade, 1 every 2 years in the United Kingdom, have been found after sheltering in bins and being accidentally tipped into bin lorries. Bizarrely, when you're drunk, if you want to get out of the rain, you'll crawl into almost anywhere. And if you crawl into a bin or a skip, tragically, this kind of thing can happen. And while they were looking for his body, and they did carry out a 2-year-long investigation, they dug up a landfill site out near Newmarket, and they found a skull. And the skull in question turned out to belong to a 1940s, a woman who was murdered in the 1940s near an American army camp there. And her skull was never recovered. And they actually discovered it while they were looking for for somebody else, but they never found him. The whole case is, as I say, a horrible tragedy, and I only mentioned it in passing simply because it ends directly behind Moyses Hall. But as you can see, if you did want to get out of there, and there is a tiny chance that Corrie could have done that if for some reason he wanted to, he could have easily climbed on the bins and climbed out over various routes, or climbed up and through. There are ways you could do it, but it would involve Spider-Man-like antics and climbing over roofs, which I really don't think he was doing. So tragically, the bin lorry, which would have gone past my house that morning, yeah, I think that might be the answer. Oh, okay. Well, that brings us to the end of the main part, but there is still more to go. I'm going to go back. And although I've been talking for an incredibly long time, I'm going to ask you to be patient for a moment and go back to Polstead right at the beginning. And I'm going to end with a much more interesting ghost case. Is everyone all right for another 5 minutes? And then we'll stop, yeah? So I'm just going to try and find it. If you have to go, by all means go, of course. My favourite story of Polstead hauntings actually doesn't have anything at all to do. Well, does it? We don't know. Let's see. Let me tell you the story and see what you think. So, in 1990, myself and Nicola Jordan, now Nicola Tolbert, who was my girlfriend at the time, went round Suffolk for a whole summer because we were young and excitable, and we were looking for evidence of hauntings. And we went round, and our method was simply to interview people, pubs, village shops, etc., and talk to people and try and carry out first-hand inquiries. And Polstead was one of the places we went, and we discovered that to this day people have a rather negative view of the whole situation. A few years ago, a chap bought Maria Marten's cottage and renovated it against complaints from locals, one of whom said, "It's cursed and I'd sooner the blasted place fell down." It's not that there's a reputation for haunting, and I don't think it was ill will against a murder victim, but we have to remember that after the Red Barn crime, people came up from London, and that within a month there was nothing left of the Red Barn. It was taken apart by sightseers. Within 2 years, there was nothing left of Maria Marten's stone grave. It was replaced, it was chipped away again. The version which is there today, I think, only dates back about 50 years, because people came up and would take fragments of her gravestone home with them. The Corder family house still stands where his elder brother accidentally drowned. The church is still there, but Victorian values, hey? The Victorians took away, by 1836, every trace of the second tomb. So, Corder is a great story, but it's not the most interesting one. The most interesting one centres on the old rectory and the modern haunting that began in 1978 when the new incumbent of the parish, the Reverend Hayden Foster, arrived with his family from Ireland. For the first few days, things were going really well. A large number of guests arrived to witness the Reverend's official service of welcome to the parish, and the vicar and his wife decided to move into the spare bedroom. At 3 a.m., Margot Foister was startled awake, sure she heard one of her children screaming. Suddenly, she became aware that an invisible something had its grip on her throat and was squeezing the life out of her. Numb with horror, she looked frantically around the room, only to find that it had changed. Instead of the cosy room she knew, it now had peeling wallpaper and an air of desolation. Somehow she seemed to have slipped back in time. She managed to gasp out a frantic cry, and then she prayed. And as she prayed the Lord's Prayer, normality returned. She did, however, feel an incredible, overwhelming resistance as she tried to say the words, "Our Father who art in heaven," and was aware of a truly diabolic evil. When her husband also felt the presence and heard strange noises, the family fled. They had managed to stay in the rectory for only 5 days. The bishop said prayers and the church quietly sold the house off. From time to time, it's on the market, the old rectory Polstead. It's worth rather a lot of money. But the widow of the former rector told the press of her strange experiences in the 16 years she lived in the house that the rector from before the Foisters. Several times at 11:30 at night, they would hear the sound of gravel scrunching as someone came down the drive, but the visitors never arrived. On other occasions, they heard heavy footsteps walking up and down the stairs when they were lying awake in bed. There had been reports of hauntings there earlier, and in the 1800s an incumbent had performed an exorcism, though obviously without much effect. So Polstead Rectory, like Siddiston in Parsonage in Norfolk, and like Rattlesden and a few other cases around Suffolk that I know of, are fascinating buildings because they are genuine hauntings. That is a case where different people who weren't aware of each other's experiences had the same kind of experiences decades apart. And I think whether or not it is related to the events at Polstead in 1827, there is so much supernatural lore around Polstead that the villagers, much as they don't like it, will be coping with its infamy for decades to come. May they not be troubled by ghost hunters like the people of Borley. And on that note, I have one more talk. In a couple of weeks' time, I will return to give my last talk to ASSAP, which will be on the Bennington Triangle, 3 mysterious disappearances, and my theory as to what actually took place in each. But I hope you were at least tolerant of my lengthy reading of my notes I took on the trial records of William Corder. And I hope that some of you will at some time take the opportunity to go to Moyses Hall and see his remains, and perhaps to talk to Moyses Hall Museum and spend a night in the Haunted Museum yourself. And on that note, thank you very much. I'll take questions if there are any, though I suspect most people want to go and do something else now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, CJ. Much appreciated. That was a wonderful, thoroughly deep, insightful talk that I was thoroughly fixated on. I have to say, my phone was ringing, my doors went, there were some Jehovah's Witnesses at the door. Everyone wanted my attention tonight, but no, my attention stayed with you because that talk was really profoundly interesting. And it clearly touches a lot of people in many different ways. Here, Kieran is talking about his obviously family connection to it. There's Nicola who says she also has a personal connection to that story as well. So this story, for more than 100 years, of course, is deeply etched into the community who live in that particular area. And of course, it's the echoes of that time to today will all carry through. And no doubt these hauntings and stories and these encounters will carry forward. And thankfully today, you've been able to put forward a message to the internet and to the world, a very thorough and deep discussion about what it is.